Hello, this is Miss Elmeer. Today we're going to look at some of the metaphysical conceits within John Donne's poems. And later on, after you identify some of those, you are going to work with one another to talk about how they contribute to the overall meaning of his poems. John Donne was a very famous metaphysical poet. Samuel Johnson was a famous critic, and Johnson wrote of Donne, "The metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was their whole endeavor, but unluckily resolving to show it in rhyme. Instead of writing poetry, they only wrote verses, and very often such verses as stood the trial of the finger better than of the ear, for the modulation was so imperfect that they were only found to be verses by counting the syllables." So Johnson wasn't a strong believer in the musicality or lack of musicality in John Donne's poem. He did appreciate the intellectualism behind Donne's poetry, but he felt to a certain extent that Donne's poetry lacked some musicality. We're going to look at some other terms also when we study. So we're going to look at Aubade, and Aubade is a poem where the sun has come up, it is now daytime, and the two lovers must separate. So typically, one of the speakers at least, if there's more than one, is lamenting the break of dawn and wants the sun to go away. And John Donne's poem, The Sun Rising, he is upset, and he refers to the sun as a busy old fool. When you talk to an entity that can't answer you back, that's an apostrophe. Sometimes the speaker will shout out at Mother Nature. In The Sun Rising, the speaker is shouting at the sun, wanting the sun to go away. Other times people address somebody who has passed on or somebody who is no longer alive. Whenever a speaker makes a direct address to an entity that can't answer him back, that is typically an example of an apostrophe. John Donne was a metaphysical poet, and he is famous for using metaphysical conceits. Metaphysical conceits are elaborate, almost bordering on ridiculous metaphors that are highly intellectual and very intriguing and interesting. We're going to learn a little bit more about that last term. There are a couple types of conceits. If we look up here, we see that a conceit is a figure of speech which makes an unusual and sometimes elaborately sustained comparison between two dissimilar things. So a conceit is an elaborate metaphor. The two types that we want to focus on are one, the Petrarchian conceit. Used in love poetry, this exploits a particular set of images that border upon cliché. Oftentimes the lover is a ship on a stormy sea, and his mistress is a cloud of dark disdain. Or else the lady is a sun, whose beauty and virtue shine on her lover from a distance. You'll see Shakespeare having a little bit of fun with this idea in his sonnet, "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun." The metaphysical conceit associated with the metaphysical poets of the 17th century is usually a little bit more intellectual. It sets up an analogy between one entity's spiritual qualities and an object in the physical world. Sometimes this conceit will control the structure of the whole poem. Probably Donne's one of his most famous metaphysical conceits is in Valediction Forbidding Mourning, where the speaker compares the love that he has for his beloved and his desire to return to her to the 2 feet of a drawing compass, one always coming back to the other. Metaphysical conceits are interesting because they will take something very spiritual or emotional and they'll compare it to something that is earthly and very much everyday. And I think probably the most famous conceit in all of the Donne poems is the one where he compares the flea to the act of love between two lovers. And let's just look at this verse that you might all remember. "Mark but this flea, and mark in this, how little that which thou deniest me is. It sucked me first, and now sucks thee, and in this flea our two bloods mingled be. Thou knowest that this cannot be said, a sin nor shame nor loss of maidenhead. Yet this enjoys before it woo, and pampered swells with one blood made of two. And this, alas, is more than we would do." So the speaker is trying to convince this lovely maiden to go ahead and surrender her maidenhood, and he likens her surrender to the commingling of blood that happens when a flea first bites him and then her. This is probably my favorite metaphysical conceit personally. This is from A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, and this is when the speaker likens his departure from his beloved to the drawing compass. So you can see right here, he is on one foot of the compass and she is in the center. And as he travels around, he will always come back and be with her. So she is the steady foot in this whole process. He says, "Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat." This here, too, is another conceit where he's comparing their separation to the separation of gold. If they be two, they are so too, as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, thy fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth if the other do. And though it in the centre sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after it, and grows erect as that comes home. Such wilt thou be to me, who must, like the other foot, obliquely run. Thy firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun. Although we've mentioned it before, I'm going to say it one more time. An Obeyed is a love lyric in which the speaker complains about the arrival of the dawn when he must part from his lover. John Donne's The Sun Rising is an example of an Obeyed, and so is The Good Morrow. Okay, here we go. In poetry, an apostrophe is a figure of speech where the poet addresses an absent person, an abstract idea, or a thing. Apostrophes are found throughout poetry, but they're less common since the early 20th century. Poets may apostrophize a beloved, the muse, God, love, time, or any other entity that can't respond in reality. The word "oh" is often used to signal such an evocation. And we talked about how in The Sun Rising, the speaker uses an apostrophe when he addresses the sun. He says, "Busy old fool, unruly sun, why dost thou thus through windows and through curtains call on us?" Now this is a very famous poem, and Billy Collins has a funny remark because he has a poem about memorizing the sun rising, and when one poet refers to another poet's work, not only is that an allusion, but it's also an example of intertextuality. And so this is a funny line from a poem by Billy Collins about trying to memorize the sun rising. And his first stanza about Donne's apostrophe is, "Every reader loves the way he tells off the sun, shouting 'busy old fool' into the English skies, even though they were likely cloudy on that 17th century morning." In The Sun Rises, Donne continues to make use of conceits, and he also continues to address the sun with more apostrophes. He tells the sun she, meaning his lover, is all states, and all princes I, nothing else is. Princes do but play us compared to this, all honors mimic, all wealth alchemy. Thou sun art half as happy as we, and that the world's contracted thus. Thine age ask ease, and since thy duties be to warm the world, that's done and warming us. Shine here to us, and thou art everywhere. This bed thy center is, these walls thy sphere. So this is a real interesting analogy because now he compares the lovers in their bed to the earth. So they are the entire world. And here is an analysis from poets.org for The Sun Rising, where the critic says, "The sun, having been shown the door, now gets asked to remain. The pronouns I and she disappear, leaving only us and we. Thus combined, the lovers become the whole earth. So that is another conceit. And since the sun's job is to warm the earth, it ought to stay where the lovers are and orbit them. Not only will Dunn and Anne escape detection and censure, since the sun will never shine anywhere else, but the lovers won't even have to get out of bed. Okay, for our purposes here, we have a prompt, and what we're going to do with our prompt is we've based this prompt on AP Poetry Explication prompts from the past. So analyze how Dunn uses figurative language within one of the selected poems and explain how his use of these devices adds to the meaning of the poem. The important part of the prompt here is adds to the meaning of the poem. I also wanted to talk about figurative language because in the past, when we have gotten this question for the AP exam, students have balked because they weren't necessarily sure what figurative language was. We get to choose for our purposes here between 6 Dunn poems. When you take the actual exam, you will not have a choice of poem. You will either have to compare and contrast 2 poems or you'll have to explicate 1 poem. But for our purposes here, we will get to choose from 6 Dunn poems, and that's coming up. We're not doing that yet. For now, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about what figurative language is and how we use it and identify it. So, figurative language is used by poets to give words more impact. Writers use figurative language to go beyond the real meanings of words to make a comparison and give the readers new insight into the content of the written work. Figurative language appeals to the senses of the readers, and it has 5 different forms. It can take the form of understatement. So an example of understatement would be the totes. It can take example of emphasis, like hyperbole. It can take the example of relationship. So we might talk about contrasting imagery. It might focus on resemblance. You know, when a writer uses a simile, a metaphor, or analogy. It might focus on figures of sound, like onomatopoeia, assonance, or alliteration. It might focus on an error. An example of an error would be catachresis. And an example of catachresis would be, you know, she has a blind mouth, meaning I've taken something that is typically associated with eyes and sight and I've applied it to speaking, and so now I'm saying somebody doesn't know what she's talking about. So a catachresis is an example of a fun and imaginative error that a writer can make intentionally to add meaning, and he's bringing those 2 terms together to make new meaning. Verbal games, you know, think of insults or even neologisms and different wordplay that you can do. Anything where you play upon words to create or add meaning would fall under the category of verbal games. Okay, we're going to play a little game here. We'll have a creation game. What you're going to do is you're going to create an example of each one of these. So all of these are different types of figurative language, simile, metaphor, personification, onomatopoeia, etc. What I'd like you to do is, if you will please write down an example of each. Maybe you remember one from a poem or story you've written before. Maybe you remember one from a famous poet, or maybe you're just creating one from scratch right now. If you can list something for each different element, that will be great. We'll give everybody a few minutes to do that. We'll wait for everybody to finish, and then we will share and see what each of us has written. Okay, these are the 6 Dunn poems that we will choose from. And what I want you to do is pick your favorite poem, choose one of these 6 Dunn poems, and analyze how the use of figurative language adds to the meaning of the poem. Notice this part of the prompt in capital letters. Go beyond the recognition of the device to build ideas. Even if you must use a 3x3, a 3x3 is better than nothing. We need to come up with ideas about the poem. We cannot simply rely on identification of the literary term at work. Okay, here we go. This is our last slide. And I wanted to direct you, there's 2 different tips that I want to leave you with. The first one is right here. It's my little joke, my pun here. Imagery and irony put in your eyes so you can see. Before you write any poetry explication or any passage explication for that part, you always want to check for these 2 things. You want to check for imagery and you want to check for irony. They are essential ingredients and they are probably present. You want to look for patterns of both. And you want to see what kind of symbolism you can detect from those two things, because you remember, we don't just want to focus on the literary device, but we want to talk about the idea that the device implies or that the device contributes to. And the other thing that I want to leave you with is this. This was very important this year at the end of the year. Pretty much almost every teacher at my table said this. Why do the students continue to organize their essays around the literary devices? Why don't they just go to the narrative line of the poem? Not only can you use the narrative line of the poem, but you can also focus on ironies within the poem. You could focus on tone shifts. Maybe the speaker starts off somewhat downtrodden and then ends up uplifted once he has a resolution to his conflict. You might see some dominant contrast or patterns in the poem that you want to point out. Or maybe you just want to organize your poem around your different ideas or tropes that you see within the poem. Probably any one of these ideas is better than using literary devices, because so many of the poetry explications are organized around literary devices that it really has a tendency to put the reader to sleep. The readers, remember, are reading for about 8 hours each day. They read for almost 8 days. They are very exhausted. You don't want to make them work too hard. You want to have glowing, lovely ideas that are overt and easy to recognize. You want to have insightful, imaginative, interesting, engaging things to say. So let's practice that right now.